Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Today we are looking at Luigi Sansonetti, a legendary commander on the Italian tree, and we'll go through his skills, his background, and if it makes sense in case you see him anywhere to be available to get this captain for your Italian ships and how to use him. Sansonetti himself was one of the more famous admirals in the Italian Navy during the Second World War. He started out as a cruiser captain even before the Second World War in the 1930s. He was on the Fiume, I think it was a Zara class heavy cruiser, and then during the Second World War he actually became a rear admiral and was leading the cruiser division on board of the Trieste, which was a Trento-class heavy cruiser, through various engagements in the Mediterranean, until he took control over the organization of convoy and supply for the North Africa campaign, and eventually, Italy surrendered, and he was sort of the last man, the last man keeping, switching off the lights and keeping the door shut in a very orderly manner. He did get various commendations for his courage while in command of the cruisers and in general. So, Sansonetti, I think that was the first legendary commander on the Italian tree. By the way, if you are looking for more details on Italian, just in Italian things in general, during the Second World War, it can be really difficult to find things in English. So here's just a little trick for you from the research side. Look for use Google Translate to translate a couple of keywords into Italian, then try to find actual Italian sources, and then use Google Translate or whatever translate software again to translate them into whatever your primary language is, because you'll find a lot more details. I've spent over an hour scouring the English sources trying to find out what he actually got his medals for, and there was absolutely nothing. But once it clicks and you look it up in, say, the Italian Wikipedia, just as a starting point, suddenly you have a lot more details, because things tend to show up in their native language. So, Sansonetti, in history, a cruiser commander or a rear admiral in command of a cruiser division. In the game, very much so the same. Let's go through his legendary skills to begin with. So he can get the Torpedo Alert Plus, which means you are detecting torpedoes from further away. He gets the Artillery Maintenance Expert, which if you're full health or mostly full health, you get a 4% dispersion buff and a better traverse. This is sort of a temporary skill, because most of the battle you're not going to be above 75% hit points. But it's more for the beginning of the game. Sixth Sense skill is very, very useful, especially in Italian cruisers that have fuel smokes. So it tells you when you are about to be shot at, because it effectively counts how many other players are locked onto you. So that can be quite useful to know when you need to disengage, especially that Italian cruisers are fast, but not turning particularly well. He gets the Marksman Plus, which gives you precise aim, duration, and cooldown. I think Italian cruisers throughout at least the tech tree ones, only get precise aim 1, but they do get a fair amount of them in higher tiers. So that's kind of useful. He does get the Honor Seeker Plus, which gives you 2% damage for every medal that you can make. It's not a super useful skill, especially in a cruiser that has defensive AA. You may kind of be thinking, okay, maybe I'll get under air attack. I'd rather take the compartment maintenance, but it's there. And here's the interesting one. Here's the big one. Here's the one that everyone is looking for, because the usual commanders, and actually let's take a quick look at that. So if I'm going to take a regular commander, they get the IFHE skill, which doesn't make sense on most Italian ships, because most Italian ships don't have high explosive shells. They have semi-armor piercing shells and armor piercing shells. So that's a little that's a little one of those okay kind of gotcha moments, but most Italian commanders get that, whereas Sansonetti actually gets the combined skill. So both HE and SAP get a 15% penetration boost. Now, we don't know exactly if semi-armor piercing behaves like armor piercing in terms of penetration, as in it has an initial penetration, and then so when the shell leaves the barrel, it has a penetration value of how much armor it can get through. It loses, or that value gets reduced as over flight time, and then once it impacts, the remaining penetration happens. That's why the APCS has actually two factors. It's got the maximum penetration, so it increases the amount of armor the shell can punch through when it leaves the barrel, and it also increases or decreases the loss of penetration over time. Whereas for semi-armor piercing and for the specific semi-armor piercing skill here, it only uses the HE factor, which is just a flat-out higher penetration factor. So not quite sure, because semi-armor piercing shells actually function practically more like armor piercing shells, as in they can bounce, whereas HE shells don't. So I am not sure. I'm not sure if the same mechanics apply and we just get the overall penetration improved, or if semi-armor piercing shells in terms of penetration just work like HE shells. But it's nitpickery, because in general it makes your semi-armor piercing shells hit harder. Now, we do have to do a very brief detour to understand semi-armor piercing shells. What is the difference between high explosive armor piercing and semi-armor piercing? Armor piercing generally has more penetration, and but does have the penetration. So sort of the armor penetration mechanics, such that it can semi-pen, or it can bounce, or it can over-penetrate, depending on how much armor it encounters when it impacts. High explosive shells don't really have that. In return, high explosive shells, curiously enough, do less damage. You'd think high explosive shells would do more damage, but well, game mechanics. Semi-armor piercing shells are a bit weird in that they have more penetration than HE shells, less penetration than armor piercing shells. So they're sort of in the middle between the two in terms of penetration, or somewhere in between, but they actually do more damage than the armor piercing shells. On the account of the semi-armor piercing shell combining both the higher payload of a high explosive shell and the higher penetration, or comparatively higher penetration, by having some armor piercing mechanics applied to it. So as we can see here on the Amalfi, the T8 cruiser, we do about 165 points extra damage with the semi-armor piercing shells. That'll be important later. So this improves the penetration of the semi-armor piercing shells, and that's it for its special skills. So the big question, generally the IFHE skill is for most ships kind of discouraged, because in most cases the armor piercing is just better because it does more damage than the high explosive, and if you know where to aim, even with lower caliber guns, you can do substantially more damage with armor piercing shells than you can do with high explosive shells. So buffing the penetration of high explosive shells doesn't really make sense. Here it's kind of inverted, because you are actually doing more damage with the semi-armor piercing shells. So buffing the penetration of semi-armor piercing shells is good. However, semi-armor piercing shells have a lower base penetration than armor piercing shells. And this is where the gun caliber becomes interesting, because if we're considering Sansonetti as a cruiser commander, then we're talking about 203mm guns, or 8-inch. If we were to look at battleships, so let's have a look at Italian battleships at the Vittorio Veneto. Now here things get quite interesting, because while the Vittorio Veneto can fire both armor piercing and semi-armor piercing shells, the difference in terms of damage, excuse me, the difference in terms of damage is actually substantially less. While the semi-armor piercing shells are still doing more damage than the armor piercing shells, In most cases, you're better off firing the AP, unless you are firing at things that armor piercing actually over-penetrates. So on a battleship, having the improved penetration on the semi-armor piercing shells doesn't mean that you can suddenly start using semi-armor piercing shells on battleships against other battleships and do full penetrations like you would with armor piercing shells. So if you are planning to use Sansonetti as a battleship commander, he doesn't quite get the same value out of the improved semi-armor piercing unless, that's a very unless, you are in situations where you are starting to weak point target, because technically, I know in practice this happens, but technically semi-armor piercing shells can't overpenetrate. So if you're shooting at the 30 odd millimeter bow plating of an enemy battleship with semi-armor piercing, you will probably have full penetrations, although you're not going to get citadels. Should you be using Sansonetti then? Well, no, because something like the Vittorio Veneto has 381 millimeter or 15-inch shells. These things have enough oomph behind them to penetrate 30 millimeters of bow plating on a battleship anyway. You don't need the extra pen and from the skill, and the extra pen is not going to be good enough to get you reliable penetrations elsewhere where you would actually get citadel hits. So on a battleship you would want the APCS, and in that case Sansonetti is a bit less useful because you would be skimping on that legendary skill. But let's get back to cruisers. So I have put Sansonetti on the Amalfi just because I wanted to get into a T8 game, and I've boosted it with everything that we have, and I've set him up like I've shown you here. I think the two really interesting skills here for him, and yes, actually this has another impact, because the Italian cruisers get defensive AA. But if you are using Sansonetti, that means you're probably not going to get the battlefield support for an extra skill, and you're definitely not going to get the defensive air expert, because you very much want the 6th Sense skills. The 6th Sense skill is amazing on any ship, because it gives you a heads up when you're about to be shot at, and that is extremely valuable in many cases. So that's definitely a skill that you want out of a legendary commander, which means you're not going to get these two. But anyway, so I have put him on the Amalfi, and I'll show you a game. So this is with the improved semi-armor piercing penetration. I'll show you around, and also what that means kind of depending on what you're firing at. We find ourselves in a game against Graf Zeppelin, a Magi, a Black Vittorio Veneto, another Magi, Colorado, a Zara, and a single destroyer, that being the Mayhem. Now, I did say earlier that semi-armor piercing doesn't overpenetrate. Well, I'd say it shouldn't overpenetrate. It does on occasion. I've seen it, especially in lower tiers against destroyers. So it's not 100%, but most of the time it doesn't, which is one reason why Italian ships in general and Italian battleships in particular are so dangerous against destroyers, because the semi-armor piercing absolutely obliterates them because it does full penetrations. On PC, they've realized that and patched it out. On Blitz, not so much. So anyway, we are escorting 2 battleships here, and I'll be sailing towards Sea Cap, and we see already that we are facing a Colorado, and there's something else inside Sea Cap, so that's going to be the Mayhem. The Mayhem is going to be somewhere around here. I am spotted. I am now being targeted. That can be, okay, they've dropped target, so that could have been a Colorado. And there is a second battleship, the Black Vittorio Veneto. I'm starting out with the semi-armor piercing, and you get semi-armor piercing loaded. And you see that if you're not particularly targeting, you get, even with the improved skill, and these are the Mayans torpedoes, even with the improved skill, you get you get semi-penetrations and bounces. Whereas if you start targeting the bow section, which has 32 millimeters of plating on the Vittorio Veneto, then you are going to do a lot more damage. So with these shells, you're going to have to aim at weak spots. Now I'm switching over to the armor piercing, and just to show you what happens if you use the AP in a more traditional manner, as you would say. And the AP kind of works without any kind of buffs but it does manage to get the semi-pens on the Veneto's bow section at times. So especially with the skill active, you're sort of more, and there we go. It's just semi-penetrations from the armor piercing. Especially with the legendary skill, you are more incentivized to use the semi-armor piercing even against battleships, but you do have to target the weaker sections, and you do have also your torpedoes that you can use to great effect and to wear these ships down. The other advantage, and I'm switching back to the semi-armor piercing, the other advantage here, because the armor piercing doesn't do great, and I am going to be facing the Mayhem. Now the armor piercing is going to probably overpenetrate the Mayhem. Plus, the semi-armor piercing actually causes more damage there. You've seen we've got a couple of belt hits from that plunging fire on that very slow Colorado. Again, Mayhem torpedoes coming in from the right, but I do need to chase that destroyer. And I do need to try and keep him away from my Gneisen now here. Yep, there he is. So that was the last parting shot at the Colorado. And now it's me against the destroyer. And even with the improved penetration on the semi-armor piercing, even if you're fighting something as lightly armored as a destroyer, you're not mostly going to overpenetrate, because semi-armor piercing shouldn't overpenetrate. So you're getting a boost with none of the downside really. And now it's just a duel between myself and the Mayhem. Mayhem has smoked up. I have used my fuel smoke to make sure that he doesn't see where I am. I am going to take one torpedo here, but I did want to close in. And the other problems as a destroyer captain that you have when you're fighting an Italian cruiser is that these things are likely about as fast as you are. And I'm dropping the torpedoes a little ahead because he's about to run into the map border. And then we'll keep... you see, I'm even hitting the very weakly armored stern section of the destroyer, but even with the improved penetration skill and everything else, they are not over-penetrating. Now, I do get the occasional bounce and on the belt on the destroyer, and that happens, but in general, Italian semi-armor piercing is hilariously dangerous against destroyers. And there pop goes the weasel, and that's already the end of the battle. One more torpedo for me. So, in summary, Sansonetti is a good cruiser captain because it allows you to use your semi-armor piercing more effectively, which means you're doing more damage against battleships because you have to weak spot target anyway with the 203s. It is more effective against things like enemy light cruisers. And with the proliferation of destroyers and scout cruisers we have out there, it just makes the ship so much more dangerous against these. And if you happen to be jumped by a destroyer, you actually have the correct ammunition loaded. So it sort of allows you to use the semi-armor piercing pretty much straight out, rather than having to switch ammo types, which I think is a great addition. Whereas on a battleship, I would at least not use his semi-armor piercing penetration skill, because for the things that you want to shoot at semi-armor piercing with a battleship, like destroyers and extremely light cruisers, the large caliber semi-armor piercing has enough power anyway. For the things that you don't want to shoot semi-armor piercing at, like battleships, you're better off using the APCS skills. So that it doesn't have that effect on battleships, and so I would say it's a good choice for the Italian cruiser line. And there are a couple of premium cruisers that have high explosive, which means unfortunately for those you would not be getting the APCS skill that you want on those. So if you're playing a lot of Italian premium cruisers that actually have AG shells instead of semi-armor piercing, because they came out before SAP was introduced. I'm not sure how many there are, but there are some, like the Del Abruzzi and the I think the Duca d'Aosta as well. So a couple of them. You could still you still get the improved HE penetration, which doesn't really help you. But yeah, so for the tech tree line, definitely a very good commander. And that's it for me today. Thanks everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.